So we're going to show you how to do a little bit of a repair work on the 2.0. Every now and then you'll break a pin in. This doesn't happen if you take it and lubricate it properly, but if someone else uses it and they don't lubricate it, you're going to have a problem. So the first step in getting to this pin on the drive shaft is to take that squirt out that you just saw me remove. The next step will be to remove the blade cover. This is the black plastic piece that goes over the top of the two blades. Has 4 Allen head bolts. And then remove the connecting rod. By the way, that's called the connecting rod, so if we're talking on the phone, you'll know what it is. Then you remove the top blade. Be careful, you know how sharp these blades are. Remove the bottom blade. And now we're going to go over to the side of the machine and loosen the 2 set screws. This is going to allow you to remove this top plate, take the tension off of it. So you just simply look at this bearing. By hand you can rotate the belt underneath the plate to get to the bearings. Put your Allen wrench in and just pop them open. You don't have to take them all the way out. Just loosen them up. There's 2 of them, as you can see. And now that's going to allow you to get this top plate out. It's held in place by these 10 Allen head bolts that you'll see running along the edges. So the reason we're probably taking this off and replacing this drive shaft is because you've broken the pin. What happens if you break that pin off or you damage it severely or overheat it is you're going to get a little bulge in the side of the drive shaft. And this is going to make it almost impossible to pull this plate up and over that. We're going to take a small file and show you how to clean up that pin. Now the trick to getting this top plate off is to do it evenly. So what you see here is a little unevenly. You're trying to pull at it from one side and you're rocking it and then you're going to hammer it. We don't want to do that. We want to be able to spray a little bit of a lubricant on this drive shaft so that it's free and can move. We want to make sure there's no bulge in it. And then, as you're going to see here when I'm doing this, you'll see us take this up evenly, both sides evenly, one hand on one side, one hand on the other, and just wiggle it up. The next thing that you're going to do is loosen up that electric motor so that the belt has enough tension off of it so that you can take it off the pulley. There are 4 bolts and nuts holding the motor down. You're going to need a 1/2 inch socket wrench and a 1/2 inch open end wrench. You use the socket wrench on the underside and the open end wrench to hold the nuts on top there. There's 4 of them, but you want to loosen them enough so that this motor will pull back and forward. And this is how we get the tension off, and this is also how we retension the belt. So once we put it back together, we'll simply push the motor forward till the belt's the proper tension and then retighten these bolts. Once you've pulled the motor back and released the tension, it's really easy to get that belt to come off. Pull it off of the top pulley or the pulley off of the gearbox, either one, and just let it sit to the side there. We're going to remove the gearbox. There's a couple ways to do this. You can remove that upper drive shaft first, or as we're going to do in this video, we'll remove the entire gearbox first. Before we take the gearbox off the bracket, we're going to remove the pulley on the front of it. There's 2 Allen head set screws that hold it to the shaft, and inside the shaft there's a small piece of metal we refer to as a key stock. So just be careful that when you take it off you don't lose that, because you'll need to put it back in when you replace this. And then we're going to remove this gearbox, this black and aluminum gearbox, from the bracket. And this bracket has 3 bolts, long bolts, that go all the way through. These bolts are 7/16. So you'll need the 2 wrenches that you see here, 7/16 socket with a longer head on it, and a 7/16 ratchet. So you go ahead and take the nuts all the way off. So the last bolt that's closest to the bracket, it won't pull all the way back out because of that nut on the other bolt holding it to the cheek plate. So you're going to just leave it in place. But the other two bolts, you're going to be taking all the way out. And this is going to release this gearbox. And it's a little tricky pulling it off, but as you can see, it's not that hard. You're just going to kind of slide it back at a little bit of an angle. So once you get the gearbox out, we're going to have to take this drive shaft off the gearbox. There are 2 set screws in it, and we're going to just loosen up those 2 set screws. Again, you don't have to take them all the way out, but loosen both of them up. This is why sometimes it's good to do this while it's still attached to the bracket, but sometimes you got to kind of pry it up with a screwdriver. So there you see how we do that. It's not that hard. We put never sees and grease on these things, so they should come up easy. There's also a little piece of key stock in it. Don't lose that. You have to put it back in. So on this drive shaft, the set screws are pointed and create a dimple in them. Now we can't reset these with these dimples in them, so we usually have to take these and get a welder, a little TIG welder, to put a tiny little tap on each one of them and then file them down so they're smooth again. I can go over that if you give me a call, but you can see the dimples in the shaft that's already been had one, and here's a new one where they're smooth and clean. Now it's time to put the gearbox back in. The 3 bolts that you took out with the nuts and washers go back into the exact same holes. And you'll just start by putting it onto that bolt that you couldn't get out in the back, and then slide these longer bolts through. Put your washer and your nylock, which is a self-locking nut, on the back. Once we get all 3 of these on, we want to tighten them up just a bit. We want no slop in this gearbox, but we want it to be still a little loose because we're going to square this gearbox up to make sure that it's perfectly square with that top that's going to go back down on it. This is really important that you do this carefully. This is a tri-square, and you want to set the short end of it that has the 90-degree so that it's a little under 3 inches. This will give you the clearance to square up the top of this quite easily. Now, if you've never used a square, just watch this and see. So we use the black side of the square, and we put it on the cheek plate. And this is what we're going to square that bracket up to. Now, because we never loosened this bracket, it was already square, so it looks pretty good. And now we're going to come over and re-square this top surface of the gearbox. So we use that flat side of the bracket as our square two part. You hold it tight on that, and then you look at the space between that steel ruler and the gap from one side to the other. Now on this one, the gap is just a little bit more towards the front of the gearbox and a little bit less the back. So we've tapped the back of the gearbox down. And until you can see that it looks perfectly just flush all the way along the length of that steel ruler, you'll notice we're tilting this back a little bit too because the gearbox back. Once you get it flush like that, then we're going to finally tighten up these 3 bolts. And you want to tighten these up pretty good. Keeping this gearbox square and making sure that as you tighten it, you haven't knocked it or changed it around. So even as you start to tighten this, it's a good idea if you feel like maybe you've nudged it or bumped it in a little bit. It's a really good idea to take your square and just check one more time, because the more that you can square this gearbox up in both directions, the smoother and quieter your machine is going to run. This is the only part of adjustment that's a little bit difficult. My favorite thing, never sees. You have to use this. Use it everywhere. You want to put it on. What never seen does is it stops anything from corroding, so that when you have to take this apart again someday, it'll come apart really easy. I put it on every nut and bolt that we build these machines with. Same thing Formula One drivers use on all of their vehicles. So you put the pulley back on, you put the key stock back in, and then it's time to square this up with that upper pulley. Use the same straight edge that was on your tri-square, and as you can see, just line up the same edges so that they're smooth. Once you get this lined up so that your belt is even and straight, you can then go ahead and tighten these two set screws. Now again, you got to remember that that key stock that you put in there is directly underneath this set screw so that it hits it first. If you have it too far to one side or the other, the set screw will go in and damage that slot. So just make sure your key stock is directly under this. Here's a bit of the trickiest part to this thing. So we're now going to put the new or drive shaft with the new pins back in. Most of the time it's going to come to you with grease in it, but if you're simply putting back on one that you have that wasn't damaged, make sure there's a bit of just axle grease in it. You've also got a key stock that's going to go on this too. Now I like to put a little bit of Never Sees on this shaft, and in this thing you see we didn't do it, so here's what not to do. Put a little Never Sees on that shaft. And then go on ahead, line it up again. Now in this case there's no set screw over the top of the key stock. You don't have to worry about it. Put it in, push it all the way down, and turn it so that you can see these set screws facing you just like that. Do not tighten those set screws yet. Now you can go ahead and stick your belt back on. And here's where we haven't tightened those bolts holding the motor in. So we're just pushing the motor forward until we get it somewhat snug on the belt. Once we've got that belt fairly snug, it doesn't have to be real tight, folks. But once it's about that way, then we're going to go back and we're going to tighten all four of these nuts and bolts that hold the motor into place. And this is going to keep the belt in the proper tension. Now we're getting ready to put the top plate back on. So we want it to slip into the bearing nicely. You can take a little bit of that same grease and put it around that side of the shaft. All it's for is just to make it easier to slip this plate on. Now make sure when you're going to put this top plate on, you see the little clips, you want those facing out. There's only one way it can go on. You can't put it on backwards. And again, the same trick. You want to put it on evenly. So you want to make sure both sides are going down at the same rate. If you get it cocked, it's going to get jammed on that drive shaft, and you don't want to try and force it. Now he's using the hammer here lightly. That's okay. Once you get it down pretty close where you can put it in, start getting your bolts going in. Remember, these are the 10 Allen head bolts. Make sure you put the lock washer back on them. Don't lose your lock washers. So I like to get all four corners first of all with the bolts started. And this makes sure that your top is nice and squared up and you're not trying to crank on these bolts, and you can get it cross-threaded that way. So just put four in, one in each corner. And this is going to square the top up primarily. Now the rest of them, the other 6 bolts, can go in really fast and really easily. And from there, you're going to tighten those bolts down just until you lightly compress that lock washer. We don't want to tighten these bolts all the way yet. We still have a process that's important, which is squaring that top up with the top of the cheek plates. So once all these bolts are in place, we're going to go along with our fingers or thumb, and we're going to feel how these edges match up. How does the top plate match up to the edge of the cheek plate? And they should be flush or close to flush. If there's a little tiny difference, don't worry about it. But you want to get it to the point where it's as flush as possible on all 4 corners. As you get it flush, tighten that bolt down a little bit more. Once you get all 4 corners flush and tightened up, then you can go around and do the final tightening on all 10 bolts. And again, you never have to crank on any of this stuff. You just have to tighten it up until your Allen head wrench twists a little bit. Once you feel that Allen head wrench head twisting a little bit, you've got more than enough torque. You don't need it any stronger on any bolts. Once you've got this top in place and all flush, the next thing is, remember those two little set screws in the bearing that you loosened. We want to absolutely make sure that we retighten those right now. We're ready to put the blades back in place. Prior to adjusting that blade shaft, you still have not tightened those set screws in that drive. So we're going to shake our can. Always shake that can of fluid film before you use it, or you're not getting lubricant, you're just getting propellant. Put a little tiny dab of a little blast on each one of these pins. And then you can put your bottom blade back in. And then shake that can again and spray a little bit on the surface of the blade. Spread it around with your fingers a little bit is always a good idea. And then put your top blade back in position. And once you've got the top blade back in position, we're about to do the most important thing that we have in this repair. And that is to flush the top of the top blade with the top of the drive shaft. These need to be exactly parallel so that the connecting rod that goes between them isn't running cocked. So use that tri-square. I like to leave the handle on so I got something good to hold. Put it on the top blade. Push down on the top blade. You don't have to push real hard, but you want to keep it compressed. And then slide it over the top of the drive shaft. Keep the pin out of the way. And what we're looking for is the space between the drive shaft and the bottom of that ruler, of that steel part of the tri-square. There should be no gap. It should be perfectly flush. Now, it should be lower than that when you start this. With a flat-bladed screwdriver, you can pry up on the bottom of the drive shaft lightly and just slowly bring it up until it's just touching. Now, as this, you can see that he's raised it a little too high. So what he's going to do is he's going to tap the drive shaft back down just a hair. Just real light. Remember, I love these polyurethane hammers that are weighted. Get yourself a couple of different sizes. Tap it down and try again. Bring it up till it just touches. You should be able to slide that ruler over, and it should just smoothly go right over the top with no bump. Once you get this to where it's perfectly lined up, the next part is really critical. We're going to tighten those two set screws, and we're going to do it very lightly with the first, just the bottom one. Just get the tip in. Then do the top one and just get it lightly touching. Now watch your ruler to make sure that it hasn't changed on you. It hasn't raised up or fallen. This is a real critical part, so take your time. If it looks good still to you, then I want you to go back and tighten that bottom set screw just a little bit more. What he's doing here is he's using the light to flash below it. It helps you see whether there's any space below that or not. Now, if it's still looking good to you, go back and tighten those two set screws just a little bit again. Watch what's happening to your shaft. It shouldn't be rising up or going down. And as long as it seems to be staying good and it's perfectly parallel with the blade, then you can go on ahead and tighten these up again. Always do it one first, then a little bit more of the other one. Then go back and do the other one. And again, what we're doing is we're taking these down fairly tight. But once you start feeling that Allen head wrench's yellow head twist on you a little bit without the head of the set screw moving, that's tight enough. That's as tight as you need to get it. Okay, so we've got both of them tight. We check one last time. Yep, we're perfectly flush. We're ready to go.
Very nice.
Now we're going to put the connecting rod in place. Now in this picture, he doesn't spray the connecting rod first with a little bit of fluid film. So sometimes we're showing you how to do it wrong. Now this will work, but I like to see you put a little of that fluid film on those two pins. These pins are the place where the lubrication is most necessary every 2 hours. They're small. If they get hot, their tension and their hardness is reduced. We put a little bit of lubrication on the top of our blade. Now we're putting the blade cover back in position. And you can go ahead and tighten those bolts down. Again, they don't have to be super tight. Put your squirt back in. Plug it in and see how it sounds.